You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast.
You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. My name is Shawn Wilkie, and along with my awesome co-host, we interview the innovators in this space every week. Ivan, please go ahead and get us started.
Hey, I'm excited to introduce Kaitlyn O'Connor. Kaitlyn is a senior counsel at Nixon Gwilt Law. She's a healthcare innovation attorney with a particular passion for pet care innovation, particularly in the areas of veterinary telehealth and digital health. Kaitlyn works with veterinary innovators to help them build and grow their businesses by establishing a firm foundation of compliance, navigating complex legal and regulatory frameworks across geographies, and efficiently negotiating and closing deals. Kaitlyn, welcome to the show. Thank you for finding the time.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
So, very interesting topic. I think that we will be narrowing it down into what are the regulations out there around the telehealth and the digital health. But I want to start a little differently before diving right into it. What brought you to pet industry, and how do you go from the law towards the very specific law in the veterinary domain?
Sure. Great question. I would say the first thing that brought me to this industry is my dogs, my two golden doodles that I love so much, and that I would love to be able to access telehealth for them in a lot more of an efficient way than currently exists, at least in the US. So that was thing one. Thing two is I work a lot in the human telehealth space, and we see a lot of very similar challenges for companies in the human telehealth space that companies in the telepet space or the veterinary telehealth space are facing. So as a firm, we sort of identified that parallel and thought, it doesn't really seem like a lot of other lawyers are focused on this area. It doesn't really seem like a lot of other law firms are investing into this area yet because it's so small. And being an innovation focused firm, those are the areas we really love to kind of dive into and find our niche in. So when I sort of identified this as an up and coming space, I thought that would be great. We've already got some good experience on the human side. I wonder if we can make that work on the pet side as well. And that's kind of what we're doing now.
That's awesome. Before we dive further in, I want to tell you my favorite question that I get from many people when we were talking. So at Galaxy, that's my current startup. We're heavily involving telemedicine into the flow and to expand the throughput of the system, and just to make the access to care more available. But the favorite question when I explain to investors what we do through telehealth, they say, "Wait, but dogs can't talk on the telemedicine appointment. So how do you do that?" And my favorite answer is they also can't talk in the exam room. So this is but anyway, aside from that, which side do you play on? So basically, do you help the veterinarians? Do you help the larger companies? There's a number of them right now that provide telehealth and plus minus prescriptions, which is also a topic probably that you bump into a lot. Or are you on this side of the industry or associations? Whose side do you play on?
Great question. I play on the side of the innovators. So that can be small companies or large companies. My favorite type of client to work with is an early stage company that is just sort of getting their feet under them, because I like to help companies understand from the beginning what their challenges are going to be and help them navigate those challenges along the way. However, larger companies that are getting into this space are facing many of the very same challenges that those early stage companies are as well. So those are fun for me to work with as well. But the broader answer to your question is I'm really on the industry side, the companies that are providing the technology and innovating in this space. That overlaps a lot of the time, and we'll talk about this when we dig into the topic, but that overlaps a lot with the providers, because I think in this industry, veterinarians are the ones that are identifying the problems most often and trying to create solutions for them. So I'm certainly working with veterinarians quite a bit. And when we talk about telehealth, we really are marrying company and industry with providers. So there's a little bit of overlap there, but really the side that I'm on is working with the companies, growing their business. How do they access veterinarians and veterinary hospitals to help them make their day-to-day more efficient? or how do they go directly to pet owners like myself and make their day-to-day more efficient as well?
Yeah, it makes tons of sense, Kaitlyn. So interesting that you have this experience at your firm with the human side, because what happened during COVID is no one went anywheres and telemedicine became a thing. It wasn't optional. It totally became a thing. And to some degree, and probably a lesser extent, that happened in veterinary medicine in some jurisdictions. But what lessons from the human world can we learn about in veterinary medicine?
There are so many. I think one of the major lessons that we can learn is the laws are almost never going to keep up with innovation. Innovation is almost always going to outpace the laws and the regulations that are in place, because creating new laws takes a long time. A lot of the laws and regulations that are in place are very old. And so we see this on the human side quite often. We've seen it during COVID. When you get into a new industry like this, a lot of the times the laws are either going to be semi-prohibitive or very restrictive to your model, or they're just going to be silent, which is actually sometimes more common. The laws are going to be silent as far as what you can and can't do because nobody's really ever thought of it before. So I think one of the lessons that we can learn is the laws are going to be unclear. And so the best thing you can do for your business is understand the risks that you are willing to take and how you're going to manage those risks as you grow, in light of the fact that you may not know today with 100% certainty whether what you're trying to do is going to be allowed a year from now. And how are you going to quickly pivot if the laws change in a way that's bad for you? And how are you going to have an impact now to make sure that the laws and regulations evolve in a way that actually allows you to do what you want to do in a way that's best for the patients and the providers? And we've had to do that a bunch on the human side. We're still doing it all the time. And that's one of the things that I think the veterinary industry is very focused on right now as well, is just sort of navigating those old laws and then also making sure that they change and evolve in a way that aligns with the way that innovation is heading right now, which is toward this virtual model for veterinary medicine.
It's a really sobering way to think about things that are antiquated. So thanks for that. Yeah. Because we've had lots of discussion and conversation either on this podcast or on webinars or with friends and colleagues that, it's just very easy to look at the situation and be frustrated. But I think that's evolution, right? We need to update things. We need to change things. So what's being done now to improve the way that we look at it, and who's leading? Who's, we know, obviously we're both Canadians, so we know Ontario's doing a bunch of really cool stuff, but who's leading the path in the US for other people that maybe need to follow in their footsteps? Because having those good news stories may help our listeners push this thing forward by saying, hey, take a look at what's going on over here, over there.
Sure. So a couple of people that I can think of off the top of my head. The first is Mark Cushing. I know you all had him join a webinar in the past. He is really, really leading the pack on the policy side of things. He's really on the ground from state to state, telling veterinary boards what they need to do to get their regulations up to date to allow for veterinary telehealth. So he's really leading the pack. He's got a company called the Animal Policy Group. They're really great. In a way that is somewhat surprising to me, some of the very large companies and brands that we know in the veterinary industry, like Mars, are leading the way in terms of innovation. They're really getting out there and sort of putting their money on the line and putting things on the line to make sure that they can innovate and they can provide things to patients. And then shamelessly, our firm is probably leading the way when it comes to legal representation. It's a new area, and law firms kind of have the reputation of waiting and not really investing a ton of time and money into these very new and evolving areas until it's more established. And we're just not like that. So we're trying to lead the way in terms of legal representation and making sure that companies understand the legal environment and can navigate it successfully. And then associations like the VVCA, the Virtual Veterinary, I forget what the C is, Association.
Care.
Yeah, they just released some model regulations for state veterinary boards to hopefully adopt. that will allow for much more flexible establishment of the veterinary client-patient relationship.
What about the states themselves? Like who's doing cool stuff from a government perspective?
Sure. So on the state side, I have less good news than I do sort of bad news as far as who's making changes. A couple of states recently, Iowa and Arkansas, both just changed their VCPR rules within the last couple of weeks to be actually more strict, unfortunately. So just to sort of back up for a second, when I say VCPR, we're talking about the veterinary client-patient relationship. Every state has different rules for how vets can establish that, but the bottom line is veterinarians have to establish a VCPR with a patient in order to provide veterinary care to them, with limited exceptions. When we talk about telehealth, we're very interested in establishing VCPR virtually. So the first time the veterinarian sees the pet, it's in a virtual environment. They've never seen that pet in person, but they're able to do an exam and make treatment decisions and prescribe, etc. Many states have explicitly allowed that, although not enough. I think it's around like 7 states right now explicitly allow for that to be done virtually. And unfortunately, other states have explicitly prohibited that. So Arkansas and Iowa are 2 states that just changed their laws to require an in-person visit before the veterinarian sees a patient via telehealth. So in terms of states that are leading the way, I can look back at my list, but what's more top of mind for me right now are states that are going in the opposite direction of where we need them to be, because that's really going to limit some business models in those particular states. I actually know Virginia because that's where I'm located. Virginia is pretty flexible. Virginia allows for you to establish VCPR virtually, so that's kind of a good market to start in. When I talk to clients, we talk about what markets to start in, what markets to avoid. Virginia is a common place to start, and then those other states that are stricter are common places to kind of avoid at the beginning.
Can you give us sort of a general split in your mind? How do you say there's 5 categories of states that allow, don't allow, or 3 categories of states? I don't know how many are there, but can you just kind of put them in buckets and say those that are like Colorado, where you can to fully establish, those that are like Arkansas, where you can't? Like, is there buckets of things that you can, like, as you place them in your mind, is there like a grade from 1 to 10? I don't know what it is, but can you just, for listeners that are either entrepreneurs thinking about telehealth startup or those that are in it already, so there's like a useful nugget that they take away from this, what are those buckets?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a spectrum where one end of the spectrum is very flexible rules. The other end of the spectrum is very prohibitive rules. The states in the very flexible category are those states that explicitly allow for VCPR to be established virtually. I've pulled up a list now. So I've got Virginia, New Jersey, Idaho, Oklahoma, and Michigan is the most recent list. This is actually on the VVCA website if you need to find it. So those states are the most permissible. They have explicitly said you can establish VCPR virtually. On the other end of the spectrum, the most prohibitive are the states that have explicitly disallowed this. So states like Iowa and Arkansas, like I just mentioned, say that you absolutely cannot establish VCPR via telehealth unless you've seen the patient in person first. And then in the middle, there are some states that either don't have laws on the books and you kind of have to guess which way they're headed or which way they're going to go. And there are states that have less clear laws on the books that might not say you have to see the patient in person before a telehealth visit, but will say you have to examine the patient ahead of time. And so then it's up to the veterinarian or the vendor to determine, is it appropriate to establish VCPR virtually in this circumstance or with this type of patient? And so in the middle, things get very gray. And that's where, as a company in this space or as a veterinarian in this space, you are going to want to understand how to manage your risk and understand that if you decide, okay, this state doesn't have very clear laws, we're going to go ahead and do this anyway there and establish VCPR virtually. How are you going to pivot if they change those rules? How are you going to manage risk if the veterinary board starts asking you questions? And how are you going to make an impact in that state to make sure that those laws sort of evolve in the right way?
Yeah, that all makes perfect sense and yeah, super clear. How does this change? I mean, how do laws change? I mean, part of me says, well, you just need to get a bunch of pet owners to complain to the state board and then things will change. But, one or two people having a conversation about it, I don't think is going to work.
Yeah. How laws change is different in every state. For the most part, you have to have a politician in the state that's on your side that is going to champion a bill that has the rules that you want to see in place. So you've got to have a senator or someone in Congress propose a bill. Congress spends time reviewing that bill, changing it around, deciding if they want to implement it, and then ultimately passing it or rejecting it. And, in most states, we have two sides. In the US, there's the House and the Senate. So a lot of times both sides have to agree, which can be a barrier. That can be an area of sort of contention. But ultimately, you've got to get everybody or a majority of people to agree that the rules you're asking for should be in place. Lots of different ways to do that. You can lobby people in very traditional ways. You can join associations and organizations that are doing this work. There are, like I said, sort of a couple of associations that are doing that, including VVCA, and there's the Veterinary Innovation Council, there's Mark Cushing and the Animal Policy Group, there's our firm. Basically, you've got to find those groups that are banding together to get a majority, because you're right, just the three of us sitting here having this conversation isn't necessarily going to be the thing that changes the law, but it's the start of a conversation, and more people are going to hear this conversation now and find those other groups that are bigger and do have more power and have a stronger voice, who will then go to the state legislators or the veterinary board to get those new rules in place that we need to have for the industry to grow.
That makes sense. Kaitlyn, what's going on with these states that are going backwards? Why are they doing that? Are veterinarians telling them to do that? What's going on?
Yeah, I hate to say it, and this is another thing we've seen in human telehealth as well. I think one of the main areas of pushback comes from veterinarians. I think that there's kind of a misconception that telehealth is risky because, sort of like we said at the beginning, right? The pet can't talk. They can't tell you what hurts. They can't tell you how they're feeling today versus yesterday. And so there's this sort of misconception among a lot of veterinarians that you have to be able to touch the patient. You have to be able to touch the pet to see if you sort of push here, does that hurt? If you push here, does that hurt? And if you're not able to do that, then you're not able to appropriately examine the patient. And that's where a lot of pushback comes from. There are state veterinary boards made up of veterinarians who just aren't comfortable with the technology. And I think that's where the pushback comes from. And I think that's where these conversations really help as well. And I think that's also where test markets like Ontario, which I know you all have talked about on this podcast previously, are really important too, because those are the ways that you can take the data to those people that are nervous about it or uncomfortable with it and show them, look, like this is actually working. Similar to what we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, one of the things that I've heard that veterinarians will say is, not only can the pet not talk, but they can't generally express themselves, right? And so similarly to, well, they don't do that in person, we also think about children. In pediatrics, telehealth is very common. Human children, a lot of times, babies and very young children, can't accurately express themselves either and can't speak either, but we're very comfortable with telehealth for pediatrics because we don't have time to go to the doctor's office all the time, or we know what's wrong with them and we just need a quick checkup. And so I think that's a helpful parallel to draw as well, where in human telehealth 5 years ago, physicians were nervous. They didn't want to adopt telehealth. They were nervous about seeing patients virtually. And then slowly technology came out and people started adopting it. And then COVID hit and patients started to demand it. And the federal government and state governments moved very quickly to change the laws, at least temporarily, to allow for more flexibilities in human telehealth. And we're kind of seeing the same thing in the veterinary industry. when COVID hit, everybody wanted to see their vet virtually, and the industry started to demand it, or consumers started to demand it. And so now some states have also made those temporary flexible rules to allow for virtual VCPR. But at the end of the day, there are still those veterinarians who haven't done it and aren't comfortable with it yet enough to say, yes, let's change the rules. Actually, I'm nervous about this. Let's change the rules in a way that's prohibitive until we have more data, or until we know that this is safer. So I think that's where it comes from right now. Like I said, I also have a lot of clients that are veterinarians that identified these issues and are the ones innovating. So it's certainly not to say that all veterinarians are against telehealth, but I do think that just right now, that is where most of the pushback is coming from.
It's interesting that the veterinarians that are resisting this, essentially, like, I'm a veterinarian, right? So I know where I would be comfortable giving a recommendation online, and I know where I would not be comfortable, and I don't want to compromise my license. So I think it's almost like the industry that is resisting this consider that the vets that are on telehealth are stupid, more stupid than they are in real life. Like, I would never recommend something.
I don't think it's that, Ivan. I think it's comfort level, right? You know how to turn on a computer and do a video call really well. You do it all day long, every day. But if you didn't do that and you were still writing paper records, you'd think that this idea would be ludicrous and totally crazy.
But this is not about it. It's about the fact that if I'm a veterinarian and I can give recommendation, which I do all the time over the phone after the meeting, or someone calls the clinic and asks the question, we always do that. But somehow the industry thinks that the vets are not capable of making a call saying, no, this is not an online matter. You have to go to the hospital. I mean, if that was a simple regulation which was inserted, and then the veterinarian should be liable for things that they say, no, we can do it with a medication online rather than visiting the clinic. I think it's still a liability. It's just that industry makes that delineation between the vet physically making that call or online. So, but anyway, I think we're over the time. This is a very interesting topic, and Kaitlyn, thank you for bringing it here. It's definitely sort of driving a lot of innovation in the industry, and VCPR is hopefully faster changing and follow the human healthcare. But we always end with the two questions. The first one: is there a book, a video, a TED Talk, or something that inspired you recently on the topic that we're talking about today?
Yes. I know someone else already mentioned this, but it's a great book, so I'm going to give it another plug. The book is Pet Nation by Mark Cushing, who I've also mentioned like 7 times on this. He's really great. When I first started getting involved in this industry, I just started asking around, same questions that you're asking, right? What should I read? Who should I talk to? Who's sort of leading the way? And everything came back to Mark in terms of policy and just understanding the industry. So I think that that book, Pet Nation, does a really great job of just sort of explaining what we've seen over time with respect to owners really becoming much more involved and paying much closer attention to their pets and what's going on with them, and sort of how that relationship between the owner and the pet has changed and started to take over and create this new sort of industry.
I guess, Mark, if you're listening, we would like our royalty check because we keep recommending your book. I'm just joking, Mark. Hope you're doing well. And then a guest that we could have on the show, another innovator in the space. Who would you recommend? Again,
I'm just going to throw Mark's name out there.
Thank you so much for listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. If you want to hear about our new episodes, please follow us on any social media channel. Also, you can check out our website at veterinaryinnovationpodcast.com. See you next week.